Terribly sorry about that. I never put the microphone on. I'm so sorry about that. Thank you so much, Jens. All right, I'm going to start again. Welcome, and we are doing the first session of our new series, Early. What the early Christians believed, or the earliest Christians. What did they believe? Right. So this might be a trivial question, and most Christians would say, look, just go read the Gospels. But we have to realize and think about the Gospels in their historical place. The Gospels are early documents, and we are truly thankful for them simply because um, they have been written a very, very long time ago. And in the timeline of 2,000 years, uh, something written in the first century is truly remarkable, and we're very thankful for them. But when we take and understand the Gospels in the first century context, they are not that early because they are written about a half a century after the life of Jesus. In other words, what we have is we have first Gospels to be written from 70 to about 95 AD or CE, and Jesus' death and resurrection is pinned more or less at 30 CE. So we're sitting with between 40 and 65 years of time elapsed before they penned down these biographies, these Gospels of the life of Jesus. So once again, on a 2,000-year timeline, they're really early. But think about the people that lived during that time. Think, for instance, for yourself, what you would make of writing a narrative or a biography about someone that lived half a century ago, in other words, in the 1970s. And how you would do that if you yourself would be unable to read or write. So was 90% of the world at that time. And you have no internet, there's no books, there's no way to check what is right and wrong, really. And all you have really are the oral stories. So for us to have Gospels already is a great feat, and it is a great ask to put together all these accounts as neatly and as beautifully as Mark and the rest of the Gospels then do so for us. The thing that we want to really focus on is the reality that when a new movement comes into being, they're still busy ironing out their belief system. They're still busy discussing, deciding, and beliefs do shift over time. So we have quite a lot of, and obviously also people just don't always agree on everything, as you very well know. And as it is, we have quite a lot of evidence for Christian diversity in the second century, mid second century. By this time, we have the Jewish Christians, we have the Marcionite Christians, we have Gnostic Christians, and there was one more. We had the Proto-Orthodox Christians, which are those who fall into the line of what Paul produces for us. And even within those various sections, we also have diversity. The point is simply that if we have such a huge diversity by the second century, it would be safe to assume that even in early Christianity, everyone did not see things exactly the same. If you think about a time before the Gospels, before Paul's writings, there was no real system to which, like we would check things with today against documents, or what people exactly said. They didn't really have anything like this. And we have to be appreciative, especially of a very new movement like the Jesus movement. Early on, things would still have to be ironed out, and that beliefs would slightly change as time goes on. Okay, so it is quite reasonable for us to accept that in the first century there was also quite a bit of diversity in the ways that people believed. And I think the further you go back, the more unordered and unstructured this type of diversity would have been. We think about Paul, excuse me, if we think about our own New Testament and Paul, we have Paul himself in many of his early books speaking about his letters, Corinthians, Galatians, Thessalonians. He's speaking about others who are going around teaching false gospels. He calls them false teachers. He goes as far as to call them ministers of Satan. This is some of the evidence for us that even as early as the time of Paul, there were people who believed differently about Jesus. Now, of course, we only have Paul's side of the story. History is written by the victor. We have Paul's side of the story, and Paul calls these people, he calls them infidels, I think, at some point. But the reality would have been much more, would have been quite a bit different. That in this, that those people would not have been infidels to themselves, or unbelievers, or false apostles, or false gospel bearers to themselves, but they would have been sincere followers of Jesus, who believed that they had the right view. And they would have considered Paul to be an heretic, like, for instance, the very Jewish Christians would not have liked Paul, because Paul was telling people that the law was no longer as important as the Torah said it was. So, what we have in our timeline is we have a period about 50 years from the life of Jesus until the Gospels get penned down for us, in which we are assuming, but we are rather certain that beliefs would have changed during this time. The question is, how would they have changed? There's evidence that even in the writings of Paul's, these beliefs, they were beliefs that weren't lining up with what Paul was believing. So there's quite a bit of evidence for us. But the thing I'd like to focus on today is the shifting of ideas within the faith. I'm a product of Reformed Catholic, or the Reformed Catholic faith. But I'm a product of a more particular faction within that, and that is that my parents were teachers, preachers, pastors in the Pentecostal movement, which came alive again in the early 20th century. Later on, then, we kind of drifted into the charismatic movement, and we ended up in a kind of a new apostolic movement. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that all of us, if you're a believer or you're a Christian, the set of values, the set of beliefs, the doctrinal foundations that you hold on to is a product of process. It's a product of process throughout the ages, and there has been a lot of shifts that have taken place over time, and that's why when I was a pastor, I walked into a Catholic church and they wouldn't serve me mass, and I wasn't sure. Actually, I was quite young. I wasn't sure why I couldn't partake of the communion. It's just that our views had shifted so far that they were, to these Christians who were Catholics, we were outside of the church. That was a real strange concept for me, and I've had to deal with this all my life. Even when I was a young person, and my dad was a pastor in the Pentecostal church, the Dutch Reformed Church, which is where the church my grandparents started off in, also kind of pushed us out because we didn't believe like they believed. The point I'm trying to make is just over the last 2,000 years, faith has shifted. And faith continues to shift. It's not so obvious when you look at it in the moment, but it's much more obvious when you read about it in the history books, that the ideas and beliefs of the faith keeps on evolving, and they still continue to do that today. So the interesting fact, of course, is that even though all Protestants have the exact same sacred scriptures, you would think that they'd all believe the same thing. But that is not true. That is not the reality we deal with today, because our contexts define how we interpret the scriptures, and because they all interpret the same scriptures differently, they all end up believing different things. So much so that when I grew up in the Pentecostal tradition, I believe that those in the Dutch Reformed Church, those in the Catholic Church, and actually everybody outside of the Pentecostal tradition were not saved, were not Christians, and they were going to hell, and I was going to heaven, even though I was reading the same Bible as them. Once again, the point is just that even if we have the same scriptures, ideas shift. Some people stay with the old ideas, others move on with newer ideas, and normally those ideas are a product of the context of the people that imagine them or interpret them. So it comes to no surprise to us that even the very orthodox portions of our faith, which would be some of the things that we today still hold onto, even they were a product of process within the church, and specifically within the early, maybe the first 4 centuries of church history. Those first 4 centuries, things developed, things changed. The church was constantly having to defend itself. Which became the Orthodox view, was constantly having to defend itself against those who believed differently, um, which they called heretics, and then also against the intellectual rivals in rival religions. They constantly had to adjust and adapt in order to give a good, reasonable defense of the faith to those people. Um, for instance, final conclusions about the Trinity, and the books that are considered canonical, that we allowed into our Bibles, the one that might be lying on your desk this morning, they weren't settled before the 4th century AD. Now that's 300 some years after the death or after the life of Jesus, and still things were not settled yet. They only by the 4th century there was a type of creed that was put in place that said this is who Jesus was, and they believed that they'd finally figured it out. It took them 300 and some years. But why so long? If it was so clear from the very beginning, we probably would not have had such a long process. And all of this I'm saying to say that the early followers of Jesus did not have everything figured out. And they did not have unity in the way that they understood things, in the way that they believed things. And that's why we're doing this investigation, so that we can see, what can we learn about what they believed? Was it different to what we see today? Was it different to what Paul might have believed? What can we learn? How can we learn it? And where can we learn it from? Okay. So it is during this time, this very early time, that Paul appears on the scene in the early 1st century, towards the first half. Paul appears and he sets the course for proto-Orthodox Christianity, and most Christians today are a result of Paul's writings. He sets Christianity in a particular direction, which is not followed by the Marcionites. The Marcionites, they kind of exaggerated it and went off the other edge. The Jewish Christians didn't like Paul at all. The Gnostic Christians, they would have liked him, but they ended up in a different route than the proto-Orthodox. We want to have a look at a time that is even earlier than Paul. And so that's what we're trying to do here. So scholars today have become increasingly sure that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus, but they were compiled writings of more educated Greek-speaking Christians during the second half of the 1st century, who were able to beautifully put together all the oral tradition, the stories about Jesus that they got from their communities together in biographical form. Thus, differences in beliefs between the later 1st century Christians, those who were after the time of Paul, and the earliest Jesus followers is something we might expect, right? As the tradition might not only have evolved during this 40 to 60 years, but it also might have evolved in various different directions, as we now know it did. These changes are something we can pick up on even with careful reading of our own New Testament. So scholars are quite confident that if you take the New Testament seriously and you read it for what it says, then you'll find differing views, differing beliefs in the Gospels. And if you read beyond the Gospels into the first early letters of Paul and to the books that were written much later in our New Testament, it is possible to show that beliefs, even within our New Testament, which was written about over a period of, let's say, about 100 years, from 70 AD onwards, maybe not 100, maybe let's say 60 years, 60 to 80 years, we can pick up the differences and the evolving of the beliefs and the faith systems, even within the New Testament itself. Okay. Some examples of the evolution of ideas and ideas, traditions, and beliefs within the Gospels themselves are, for instance, I'm not going to elaborate on any of these, I'm just going to mention them. Maybe we'll do a series at some point that deals with them individually, but here are some of the ideas, concepts that seem to undergo transition within the New Testament. First one is the increasing innocence of Pilate in the crucifixion of Jesus, the increasing culpability of the Jews in the execution of Jesus, the decreasing apocalyptic emphasis in the Gospels, and even into the later books in the New Testament, the increasing demonization of Judas in the Gospels, the decreasing importance of John the Baptist in the Gospels, the increasing public exposure of Jesus's identity, primarily in the Gospels, the increasing composure of Jesus during his passion, during the Gospels, and probably the most important and most controversial one is the increasing Christology, the view of Jesus. It seems like the view of Jesus, the further we read in the New Testament, the higher the view of Jesus becomes. Okay, so these are just some of the ideas that seem to change and seem to transform themselves and evolve, even if it's slightly, throughout the New Testament. The question is just simply then, or the point to make is that if we go earlier than the Gospels, will we also expect to see different views? And I think this is quite evident, and that's the kind of things we'll be picking up on. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about the time in question. Even if we refer to our very earliest New Testament books, the early letters of Paul, they were written about 50 to 60 AD. These are, we call them the early non-disputed letters of Paul: 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Philemon, and the book of Romans. These books still place us at least 20 to 30 years after the life of Jesus. And it's these 20 to 30 years that we are going to focus on in these next couple of sessions. In other words, the time from the death and resurrection of Jesus until the time of the writings of Paul. Let's say there's a 20-year period, at least a 20-year period, in which we don't have any writings for, that the oral traditions might have moved around. What did these earliest Christians believe? Because it seems like Paul takes Christianity in a different direction. It seems like Paul is the break-off from Jewish Christianity. What did Jewish Christianity look like? What did the earliest followers of Jesus look like? What did they believe? Can we tell? How would we tell if we could? So the question is simply, how can we do this? Do we have scriptures or earlier writings to our disposal? And the reality is no, we don't have any scriptures for this period. We don't have any writings for this period. But what do we have? And so this brings us to a very important part of our of the series, and that is the idea of a pre-literary tradition. So what does that mean? I'm going to be using that word a lot. Pre-literary tradition is a tradition which is before the writing. In other words, we have writings. We have Paul's writings in the 50s AD, and these traditions seem to be older than Paul's writing. So they are pre-literary writing traditions. They could either be written traditions or they could be oral traditions. We don't know. We don't want to speculate about that. But the point is simply that they seem to have existed before Paul was writing. And Paul, being the earliest of the New Testament writers, earliest books we have is by Paul, this would then be the most earliest information about what people believed about Jesus to our disposal. And that's what makes this interesting. Okay, so the question is, what line of inquiry would we follow to get an idea of what these earliest followers of Jesus believed? Where will we turn? Well, as it turns out, that we can find even within our New Testament traces of the very early beliefs of the followers of Jesus. Just like the New Testament contains traces of shifting of beliefs and diverse beliefs, it also contains traces of earlier material that could give us a glimpse into some of the beliefs of the earliest followers of Jesus. These portions of the text are called pre-literary traditions, traditions that existed before the author wrote his work, but chose to include into his work for the benefit of his readers. Some of these traditions might have been oral traditions and some might have been written down, but to this day we haven't found any of these pre-literary traditions written down separately. So in order to investigate the earliest of the pre-literary traditions, we need to look at those traditions that are found in the earliest of our New Testament books, namely the early non-disputed writings of Paul, These were written from the 50 CE, more or less, to 60 CE. They are the earliest of Paul's writings, and it seems like in these books we do have some evidence for pre-literary traditions. Now, of course, we have pre-literary traditions, or presumed pre-literary editions in the other books of the New Testament. Yes, they are there. But we're choosing to work off the earliest New Testament books, because then we can limit ourselves to find the earliest of the pre-literary traditions. So the pre-literary traditions from the early writings of Paul are, according to some scholars, dated to around 33 to 40 CE. So this is a date which we haven't mentioned. We have no writings for this period, but many scholars believe that these little traditions, these pre-literary traditions that we find in Paul, could date as early as 33 to 40 CE. Now, that would mean 3 years after the death of Jesus. That would mean in the time of Paul's conversion. This indeed is very, very early, and it's not going to get any earlier than that. Okay, so in closing today, we need to talk about, let me see how much time I got a bit of time. We need to talk today then about, excuse me one second, the types of pre-literary material. So I'm setting us up for next week. We will be actually looking at the material. Today we're dealing with the timeline and also just a little bit of explanation around what the form of these pre-literary traditions might be. So the pre-literary material that we find in Paul's writing, it normally presents themselves in a poetic or a hymnal or a credal form. In other words, these are very structured. They're often rhythmic phrases that was well suited for memorizing and possibly even saying together. So you can think of the idea of a creed, and we'll speak about that in a moment, that these portions preserved, they lend themselves towards something that people could get together and quite easily memorize and say together. Remember that most of the first century church was uneducated, and they were unable to read and write. And so the only real way in which they could carry on the work or carry on the word would be through possibly memorizing of statements of faith, etc. So the most important tenets of their beliefs could very well have been memorized in credal or poetic form. And they could possibly have recited this together when they come together, like many churches still do today. And it would imprint into them the core belief system that they subscribe to. Okay, so these phrases, we'll call them phrases from now on, must have become so well known that later writers would actually include the phrases in their writings. They would do this to remind people of the central tenets of the faith, but also to find immediate common ground between the writer and his readers. A very good example of this is a pre-literary credal tradition we find early in the book of Romans, in the first chapter already, where Paul is writing to a church he's never been to. He's writing and he's adding this pre-literary tradition to create common ground between him and the church, because he's never been to them. He wants to ensure that they understand that they are of the same faith, so he repeats the credal tradition. And also, to some degree, he would have to later on depend on them for support. And so this was his way of creating common ground between himself and the Roman Church. Okay, so let's finish off today by just speaking a little bit about credal traditions in general. What is the definition of a creed? Well, a creed is also known as a confession of faith, and it is a kind of a symbol. It's a statement of faith. It's a statement of the shared beliefs of a community in such a form, structured in such a way, so that people could easily memorize and remember. So the creed also functions to establish a rule for correct belief in, and this we know from just historically reading about Christianity in a community. It keeps some in and others out. Those who affirm the creed, they are of the same belief than you. They are your kinship. They are what the New Testament would call brothers and sisters. Those who don't, they are false. They are incorrect. And so credal creedal ideas or creedal statements actually became very rigid walls between sects of Christianity, or possibly if today, for instance, if you don't subscribe to the Nicene Creed, we're going to be speaking about in a moment, the Christian creed, you can't really be considered a Christian, right? So these things they separate between those who are in and those who are out. That's kind of the function that they played in history. So you might be familiar with the later 4th century creedal traditions, and these are the ones that are well known. Christianity would ultimately become a creedal faith. In other words, what set Christianity apart from many of the Greco-Roman religions is that Greco-Roman religions didn't have creeds of faith. It wasn't about what you believed, it was more about how you serviced the gods and so on. But Christianity was very creedal in nature. It was important that you believed the right things. And Christianity is very much so like that today, especially after the Enlightenment. So Christianity becomes a very creedal faith, and it would use creeds to establish the boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy. So orthodoxy is the right belief, heresy is the wrong belief, or the altered belief. And so this is a very important concept right from the beginning. Who's in, who's out? Who's got the right belief? Who's got the wrong belief? And we today, unfortunately, we still have this idea that if you believe the right things, you're in. And if you believe just slightly wrong things, you're out. And it's the creeds with the dividing line between who's in and who's out. So the first official Christian creed was called the Nicene Creed and was formulated in 325 CE at the Council of Nicaea. Here it is. I'm going to read it for you. You might have heard this at some point, but I want to read it for you so you get an idea of what a creed sounds like. You can immediately recognize it as a creed. It's not prose. It's not just normal narrative. It sits neatly together. And you can hear people chant this, memorize and chant it. Here we go. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, the only begotten, that is, of the essence of the Father, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father, by whom all things were made, both in heaven and on earth, who for us men and for our salvation came down and was incarnate and was made man. He suffered, and on the third day he rose again, ascended into heaven. From there he will come to judge the quick and the living and the dead, and in the Holy Ghost. That's the Nicene, the first version of the Nicene Creed. You can hear the rhythm in it. You can understand why people would memorize this, why even today churches still, they engage in the process of reading out of creeds. This was a very important creed because it was the beginning, the real beginning, the official beginning under the Roman, for the first time under Roman rulership, kind of Constantine, that the church was starting to draw these boundaries with real imperial authority. But the interesting point is this, that the Nicene Creed was later revised in 381. So 60 years, more or less, 60 years, a little bit less, 54 years later, the creed is revised. It has to be revised to take into account some things I haven't thought about, or to bat off some new heresies that arose. And the point is that the creed, although it's supposed to be absolute and the perfect way of believing, changes. And that gives us also a very good insight on how faith kind of evolves. It believes it's 100% correct until the next revision, and then that they believe that's 100% correct. That's called evolution. So the Nicene Creed was later revised in 381 CE at the First Council of Constantinople to affirm the Trinity as a whole. And this is actually the first place where the whole Trinity is affirmed properly and officially. This is 381 CE. Thus, even as late as the 4th century, the beliefs and affirmations of the Church were still evolving and updated into the formal creeds the Church then held for very long. The creeds are used to consolidate the beliefs of any particular period, and thus any particular creed at any particular time gives us a general glimpse into the most important shared beliefs of that community at that time. This creed is rather lengthy compared to the ones we're going to be investigating. It's rather technical. If you God of God, very God, consubstantial. I mean, it sounds like they had to invent words to define the Trinity, and it seems just very obvious that the followers of Jesus, the first followers of Jesus, just didn't have the education to involve these Greek philosophical ideas in their doctrines. Their doctrines must have been much simpler. Um, their belief systems must have been much simpler. And it seems like Christianity developed a more complicated and sophisticated belief system as time went on. And they embraced a more Greek philosophical ideas, trying to find theological solutions, answering the diversity of Christian thought, the diversity of the canonized scriptures, and also the intellectual skeptics of their time. But now, it seems that the credal tradition was not just something for Christians of the 4th century, but it reaches back all the way to the very early 1st century and the Jesus movement. By identifying these pre-literary creeds and these phrase materials in the early writings of Paul, we can get a window and a glimpse into the beliefs of a time even before Paul's. As we'll see, it seems to scholars that Paul himself often used these creeds. We're going to be focusing on three. The three earliest, and according to the early writings of Paul, the three major creeds that it seems like Paul includes in his writings. But Paul is then obviously, he is known for using them, but Paul is also notorious, is not the right word probably, also known for adding to them and making them up to date, updating them in the way that they would, for instance, update the Nicene Creed. It seems like Paul was also updating creeds, that the very early creeds that he includes in his writings, he updates with updated material. So that becomes really, really interesting, as we will see a little bit later on. Now that we understand what pre-literary material is, and what a creed is, and what it does, and kind of how it works, and what it sounds like, and what it gives us, we now know how to identify more or less the creeds within, or pre-literary creeds within the writings of Paul. And this we will do next week. Next week, we're going to be looking at how to identify pre-literary material, how scholars identify it, because now you can't just go around and say, oh, this is pre-literary, I think this was written before Paul. There are certain rules that scholars apply to say, these are the 3 or 4 rules. If a passage or a portion complies, this looks and seems to us as pre-literary material. So we're going to be looking at those things next week, and then we're going to start identifying them in 3 major portions in Paul's early writings, and then the fun starts. Because once we've identified them, once we've identified what looks like things that Paul would have added onto them, we can find their core structure. And when we have their core structure, we literally, and this type of analysis is always based on probability, but we probably sit then with a creed from Christians in the 4th decade AD, which is long before Paul, long before the Gospels, long before any other writings. And that's when it becomes interesting. We can actually have a glimpse and a window into the very earliest beliefs of the followers of Jesus. So next week we'll be starting with that. Thanks so much for joining me today. Have a great day. Cheers.